I spend half my life driving down the A1 to fishing lakes. But for a pleasant change, I've come up the A1. We're at a place called Catfish Racecourse, which is a syndicate lake what Jason Bassett runs. Now, Jason has been involved with DNA for quite a few years, and for me, this is a new one because this is a fishing lake in the middle of a racecourse. But you have fished somewhere similar to this before?
Yeah, I fished a couple of waters right in the middle of race courses, but this is the first time I fished this lake.
You're the expert in racecourse fisheries.
I'm not at all. This particular water Jason's been inviting me to for, must be 4 or 5 years now, since he first took over it. And when he first got the lake, the fish were really small and they're really well sourced. He's got the VS fish, there's some lovely carp in here. They've progressively got bigger, and now we've got a fish in here that's 36, 37 pounds. So they're getting more interesting. But this is only a flying visit for us. We're only here for 14 hours. We're not here to, as syndicate members, we've just got an invite. Yeah, it's an interesting lake. It's a nice lake, quite deep water, gin clear water, and some really nice marginal areas where we're seeing quite a few fish as well.
Seen one or two. Certainly when we got here, we saw quite a lot of fish, didn't we? There was love in the sun.
But caught a couple. Had a couple of nice ones this morning. Up to 17 pounds. Jason's had a couple as well, up to low 20s. Yeah. Really nice fish. Yeah, real nice 22, 23 pounder. So, yeah, interesting trip, first trip, and enjoying it so far.
So, what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of like pick your brain and talk a little bit about baits and what DNA baits does for you. So I'm going to ask you a really cliche question, but there's a good reason as to why I'm asking you it. I'm going to ask you, what is the best DNA boilie? Now, I know that's a cliche question. I know it's going to be very difficult to answer, but there is a reason why I'm asking you that. Because I want to know what you're thinking in around the baits that DNA offer and where they come into your fishing.
Well, what is the best bait? What is the best carp bait? Is it for getting bites, numbers of fish, bigger fish? You know, lots of people have got different things that they like to achieve with the fishing. If it comes to just getting a bite from somewhere, I think you can't go far wrong with S7 because he's one of those baits that I've been using DNA now for, is it about 7 years or so? I've used it all over the place, and there's not many lakes where it's not done me a fish because it's a real good, instant, attractive bait. It's a fish meal bait. It smells nice. It's one of those baits that you can take anywhere, you know, and this is the first time I've been to this lake, and needless to say, we've gone and caught on. It's my go-to bait for somewhere that I can just go to and know that I'm going to be using a bait that's got a good chance of me catching fish. Yeah,
it's interesting because like when the S7 was kind of being developed, I was involved with DNA at that time, so I was kind of like a field tester for that bait. During that period, I wasn't in a club water or a syndicate. I was just literally, you know, having a look on the internet, finding a lake, right, I'll have a go down there. You know, something I've heard of, somewhere I've never been before. Just like I did a year, just like trekking around different venues. And literally everyone I went to, I didn't just have a couple, I was kind of bagging within like, you know, a few hours of being on the lake. I mean, I started off, I think I went to Waveney Valley, I went on Sea Lake on Waveney Valley. I had the Immaculate, in fact, I think I'd been there about 3 hours. I'd had the Immaculate Common on the bank, which is obviously a really nice fish. I went to Horseshoe Lake, I had another carve up there. I went to Thorny Weir, that was I'd love to go back there, I love that place. I'd like to have gone on that Metz as well, but yeah, again, Thorny Weir, just doing 48 hours and just like having like 8, 10, 12 fish hits on these trips. And I was thinking, this is a special bait. So for me, like obviously that was a good few years ago, and that S7 is still, like you said, it's just an instant bait. It's just, you kind of like almost you get out of jail free card, isn't it? If you're unsure about the lake, you don't know what's been working, take the S7, that's going to work for you. But originally, you was an SLK man, wasn't you? Based on its kind of big fish pedigree.
Yeah, because that's the kind of fishing that I enjoy doing nowadays. You know, I spend the majority of my time waiting for big fish, and I want to be using a bait that I know has got a good track record of catching big fish. And before I'd even worked for DNA, when I used to be the editor of Carp-Talk, we used to deal with catch reports on a regular basis, and obviously every different company that's high profile in the bait industry used to send in catch reports. And the standout bait for DNA was SLK. The amount of big fish we had reported on it, that shrimp liver krill, which, you know, regardless of what people think where the big fish baits exist, they absolutely do. And I remember when I was a young carp angler, starting out in the trade and getting a lecture off, sorry to name drop, Tim Paisley, Rod Hutchinson and Kevin Clifford. Do you believe that big fish baits exist, Crowy? Well, of course they don't. You know, a fish can't come along and tell the difference between a bait. And that's how I believed. But now, I've been carp fishing an awful lot longer, and I've seen so many examples of it. Big fish baits absolutely do exist, and they exist because generally big fish are older fish, and older fish feed completely differently to younger fish. They have completely different tastes, preferences. They have completely different biological needs and requirements. So there's some ingredients that stimulate the older fish, the bigger fish. Of course, they still stimulate the younger ones, but generally, when you're fishing for pressured fish, older fish, they've been hooked a few times. They're a lot more wary. They're a lot harder to catch. Generally, this is. You know, there are obviously some older fish that are just mugs. They get caught all the time, but generally speaking, if you want to catch a very, very tricky fish that's quite a big fish, that's been around for a long time, then SLK, you can't go wrong with it, really.
Yeah, it's funny, like going back to kind of like my vlogging days, I did a lot of vlogs in France, and regularly people would message me and ask for my advice. You know, they'd Googled the lake they're going to, and I'd happen to do a film on it, so they'd message me. And like more than once, people have said, oh, what bait did you use? What bait would you go? And I just said, take S7. And then I'd usually message them a few weeks after and say, how did you get on? And then more than once they've said, oh, my mate got some cheap stuff off this guy in the garage. And I'm like, why? Yeah, how many times do you get the opportunity to go to France? I personally go once a year. I'm not sure about everybody, but I go once a year. I want to maximise my chances. The amount of hits I have had in France on the S7, one lake owner, I won't name the lake, but one lake owner who had a complex of lakes that I went to about a dozen times, she said, I cannot remember a week where you haven't had far more than what, you know, is the norm on these lakes. And 100%, it was bait. I wasn't doing anything fancy, hadn't found a ridiculous spot. I just baited heavily with the S7. And what I was finding was, I'm convinced in the early part of the week, the better fish were feeding on my zone, but I just wasn't getting them. You know, another fish would get to the hook bait before the big one got there. But, you know, I know they say Big Fish Thursday, but that's because they'd been visiting my spot and eating on that S7 throughout the course of the week. And then eventually one of the big ones in there. And that's where I feel my French big ones have come from.
Yeah.
They've all been caught on the S7.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in bait, mate. It's nowadays we're in an industry that is literally diluted by rig stuff. You know, you've got blowing rigs for every day of the week, a Monday rig, the Tuesday rig, you know, there's rigs for whatever the weather's like, you know, there's all sorts of fancy rigs, but do they really make a difference? Well, of course rigs is important, it is absolutely important, but before a fish will pick up the rig, it needs to be attracted to the area. So bait is much more important, and people don't realise this because there's an awful lot of marketing in the industry that gets very, very powerful by an awful lot of big salesmen, strong personalities. And they're saying that the rigs, you need to do this, the fish feed like that and stuff like that. But I've always been brought up on the belief that bait is more important. Rod Hutchinson was somebody I absolutely idolised as a young kid, as a carp angler, looking up to him. He was the guy that originally made bait. You know, he was the guy that put different ingredients in. He did the tests. He was checking baits. He was testing them, and there's nothing that when Rod was alive, there was nothing that he'd not tried. And when you speak to somebody like Rod, because I did work for him for quite a while, and you saw the wealth of knowledge he had to talk about bait and his experiences with it, you could see exactly what he means by big fish baits and attractor baits. You know, there's the two big differences. There's baits that will attract you numbers of fish, and there's baits that will give you a better chance of catching bigger fish. And it's a percentage game. And if you can put the percentages in your favour, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So, you know, at the moment we're trying to get bites. I'm using S7.
Absolutely.
You know, absolutely. I'm not here to fish for the big fish today. Of course, there's a good chance with S7 you can catch big fish. Because they do come along every now and again. That's the percentages of it. But if I was here targeting here as a syndicate member and I wanted to specifically catch some of the bigger fish in here, I'd be using the SLK or even the bug. The bug's a very underestimated big fish bait. It's a newer bait. You know, the SLK's got the track record, the longevity. It's been around a lot longer.
It's got history.
It's got the history.
For the big. It's done so many, hasn't it?
My actual biggest UK carp was caught on the bug. You know, which was butted from Girton. But some of my best overseas fish, and this is just slightly going off tangent a little bit now, was actually in recent years was caught using a combination, believe it or not, of SLK and S7. You go to places where I've been fishing in Germany, which some of those syndicate waters over there.
Absolutely ginormous common that you had. Was that an SLK capture?
That was SLK and S7 combined, because over there.
How big was that thing?
That one was 76. That one was. That was a combination of those baits. You can go there and use SLK and it works. SLK does. And you can go there and use S7 and it works. But in recent years, there's a hedge on that lake by using the combination of SLK and S7 together.
Yeah.
So the point I'm getting at here is, if you're fishing a lake where an awful lot of one particular bait's gone in, the fish have all been caught on it quite regularly, and you're just looking for something, just something a little bit different, then don't be afraid to mix these baits, because they do work. I'm not saying that they all work. I've never used something like the switch with the bug combined, but you know, don't be afraid to try these things, because that's how important bait can be. Just a change of something, a slight difference can be the difference between catching and blanking.
Yeah, it's interesting because the switch is actually responsible for my UK PB, but it's not a bait that I use that much, and that seems like a really strange thing to say. The period that led for me catching my English PB started in the February, and I wanted to use the switch during the winter period. So I was feeding the zone switch and catching in February on quite a tricky lake, as you know. And then when it became more springtime, a part of me wanted to change back to the S7, and I'm like thinking, why would I want to change a bait that's caught me like 5 or 6 winter fish? Why would I want to change it? So I continued to feed with the switch, and then obviously I had a couple of really big fish off it. So the switch is a bait that I kind of only use in the winter, and during the winter I'm not using a lot of bait. But for instance, if you was to speak to Mozza, he absolutely swears by the switch. He thinks it's an absolutely outstanding bait, and it's really underachieved.
Jace originally designed it for that period of the year when they are switching into winter, and it all absolutely works. But for me, I prefer the bug at that time of the year. I've done quite well in recent times fishing on Foundry and some of the waters I fish in the Lincolnshire area. As the water starts to cool down, I don't know what it is, the bug, it just seems to work for me. So
the other thing I've used the switch for is if I've been fishing in France and the lake's got catfish in it, and I don't want to catch catfish. I'll give you an example. I went to a place called Le Bot on the Goncourt complex. So there was a lot of big catfish in there, and they're not my bag. So I took the switch and thinking I'd rather be on S7 because I know I've done so well on the S7 on that complex. And I fished the switch. I didn't have one cat, and I was fishing on a point. So I had Roger Hyde and Dave Moore. Myself was on this point, and then Clive Gibbons was a bit further on the corner. And I said to them before we got, I said, don't take fish meals if you don't want to catch them, if they're not your bag. Well, they all took fish meals, and they're like tussling with 100-pound catfish. I landed nothing but carp. I had a couple of 50s, a 60, nothing but carp, and I had a really, really good week.
So that's a really good tip then, that is.
Yeah, absolutely, because funnily enough, I'm 50-50 thinking about going to Moroni's on the Dream Lakes complex, the big one at the back. I think it's 120 acres. My friend's just been there. He's a DNA boy, and he's done really well on it. And it's a bit of me that I fancy it, but it's a lot of big catfish in there. So instantly, I've already bagged it. I'm taking the switch.
Mate, now you've just said that to me, that's the first I've ever heard of it. So
they caught. So I was in the middle of the point. There was Roger, Dave Moore, Clive. They all had at least 5 or 6 catfish each, big uns, 100-pounders. I was in the middle of them, nothing but carp. So that is if you want to go to France, avoid catfish, and you're not really interested in particles, you still want to boilie fish, get on the switch, works.
Well, when I went to Seligu last year and I caught that beast over there, I was plagued by catfish.
Was you?
Yeah. But I used
the
SLK and S7. Again, fish meal bait. And I don't necessarily think it was just because the carp fishing was slow because the weather wasn't so good. But there was a lot of catfish in that area, and I will be going back again. So I'm going to be considering using the switch now. But carp fishing is about confidence. You've got to feel confident in what you're doing. And I spend an awful lot of time fishing. So I want to be using something that I smell and I go, oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah, switch with the liquid food.
Right, okay.
Cover it in the liquid food. Really, really effective bait.
Okay, that's interesting.
So going back to what you were saying there, like when you was having these catfish, 1, did you feel it was disturbing your swim? And 2, was it a long tow to go? Because I know you was boating your rigs out. Not
very far, no. Not on that particular occasion. A lot of fishing you do at Seligu, it's under 100 metres because I can't remember what the rule is. It's you can't fish further than 100 metres, 120 metres. I can't remember. It's not very far out. Plus, most of the features are quite close in anyway. The further out you go, they tends to go deeper. And obviously, carp being carp, they tend to come in closer. The catfish were amongst the buildings where I was fishing. There was an awful lot of them around there. I think I caught half a dozen of them. And only a couple of carp on that trip.
I'm not too concerned about actually having a catfish. It's just I don't want my area of the lake disturbed because I'm going to have to take the boat back out over the spot. So I want that bait to sit there as long as I can keep it out there. Yeah. And if a cat, it's not like, oh, I've got a catfish. I just do nothing and get the rod back out. That ain't a problem. It's I don't want to have to put the boat back to where I'm fishing again.
Here's a question for you, because we talked earlier on about mixing baits. I've said about S7 alongside SLK, it works. You mentioned about using the matching liquid food with the switch. Have you ever tried switching with the liquids when it comes to the boilies, or do you always match?
And I know Moz is a real, he loves that switch liquid food. Okay. No, when I'm fishing in France.
Does he only use it with switch as well?
No, I think don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure he uses it on SLK as well when he's been out there. I think he uses it on, it might not be SLK, but I'm sure he uses the switch liquid on other baits. I'm sure I've heard him talking about that.
Yeah.
But for me, French fishing, or like if it's somewhere in the UK that I know I'm going to go with the S7, liquid food, matching liquid food, match it all up. And then very similar to you, funnily enough, when I looked at your baits that you put on yesterday, they're identical to mine. So the smaller dumbbell, absolutely covered in liquid. Get it absolutely drenched. Make that hook bait the number, because I don't think you can overdo it with the flavourings of the S7. I think. Right, so we'll go on to something that I've been thinking about. So obviously I work for DNA. In the van, I've got loads of liquids, loads of pop-ups, loads of bits and bobs that I keep in the van. As for when I'm out fishing, I've got a bit of everything to go. I think you can overhead the pudding in terms of flavouring. Now, at the back end of summer, in the autumn period, I want a really high attract hook bait. But I think this time of year, in certain situations, I've been putting too much flavour into bait, trying to draw them in. Now, with pellet fishing, I've been using the crayfish mix with that crayfish hydrospod syrup. I don't think you can go, they love it, right? But in terms of my boilie fishing, I think I've been over flavouring my baits.
I think that happens an awful lot on English moors, because we're going through a phase now where everybody's saying you've got to put a bit of liquid on something.
Yeah.
And a lot of these lakes that we're fishing, most people go fishing for like what we're doing today, 48 hours.
Yeah.
Is that long enough? You know, carp's receptors are really, really strong. They're really defined.
Absolutely.
And although we can smell it, to them it might be repelling them.
Yeah.
So sometimes I will go fishing. An awful lot of the time I go fishing, I'll use washed out baits. I just do. I'll still put liquid on it, but I'll wash it out. And certainly on syndicate waters more than day ticket waters, because syndicate waters generally, because of the stock levels, it's a little bit harder than day ticket fishing. Day ticket fishing, the fish need to take anglers' baits, so they're more willing to take bait, even though it's not necessarily massively attractive to them, because it's about survival of the fittest. Yeah. You know, we're going through a phase now, one of my syndicate waters on Foundry, where bait is becoming very, very important, and unless you're on a bait that's acceptable to those fish, they're leaving it. They're leaving it alone, and there are piles of bait, and you can see this after 2 days. The birds are still diving down on it. The fish aren't taking it. Is that to do with the attraction qualities, or is it just down to the actual overall composition of the baits? I don't know. But there's definitely something that's, you know, on syndicate waters, they're a little bit more picky than they are on day.
You've had a couple of big ones out there recently, haven't you?
I've had 3 40s out there in the last couple of weeks.
Wow. Yeah. And talk to me about that bait-wise for that. Were they washed out? Were they no liquid on them? Was it S7?
No. A lot of the fishing that I've done recently on there is bug with liquid food over the top of it, bug pellets, liquid food, 8 millers, and also then just fishing a handful of sweet corn in the mix and fishing a PB pop-up over the top of it. Right. Because that's particular to that lake. Last year,
when I was at the top.
Last year when I was on the lake, I did really well on the bug, certainly during the spring months, and then when it came to winter, autumn and winter, for some reason, the approach that I was doing was becoming very, very patchy. Yeah. It wasn't working, and needed to put something a little bit yellow in there, a little bit brighter, and that's what was giving me, you know, the opportunity to get more fish from there. And this year it started off the same. It could go back to what it was last year and the year before, where it was just fishing match the hatch over the top. But those little bits of bright yellow and PB pop-ups, PB wafters, so attractive. I remember when I first came onto DNA, and a lad on the 6 turned around to me and said, "Have you used those PB wafters and pop-ups yet?" And I went, "No." He said, "Oh, I've caught so many fish on them." And as soon as he said that, I tried it, and they are absolutely the best single hook baits, without a shadow of a doubt, I've ever used. They're amazing, amazing baits.
Funnily enough, I was just thinking there, when we was talking earlier, about my journey into being a videographer for DNA.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't mention is how much I've learned off the anglers that I've been out filming, yourself included. But Mark Bartlett, PB pop up, over a load of bait, bang on the spot, spod bang on the spot, everything's right, everything's accurate. Goes every time.
Speaks for himself.
He is in the shit. I've never, you know, I'm like, but going back into my heyday in Catfish, I was a machine. But people like Mark are in another league.
Yeah, that's Team England for you. Carp Team England's, they're all the same, those guys. They want bites.
Fabulous anglers out there.
Yeah, for that kind of fishing, they definitely. I mean, Bart is a good all-round angler.
Yeah.
I'm not saying no, he's only good at one thing. He's not. He's absolutely not a one-trick pony. He can do big fish fishing. He just doesn't fish a great deal. So when he does go fishing, he wants to maximise his chances. If there's somebody that you're going to rely on getting you a bite, it's someone like Bart, because they absolutely excel at that kind of fishing. And I couldn't do that style of fishing. Years ago, when I used to fish with Rob Hughes, used to do it an awful lot. Day ticket fishing, turn up to water. You want to get as many bites as you can in 48 hours. But now, as I get older, I don't want it. It's too hard work. It's too hard work. I don't want to go and fish in water and catch the biggest, or one bite, it's the biggest.
Yeah, you want the biggest. That's how you kind of like turned your angling
in recent years,
for a bit, haven't you?
Yeah, it's not how I started off in the trade. I started off in the trade doing pretty much what Bart did, but that's when I was younger. Over the years, I've known Bart since he was a teenager, and I've seen him go from, you know, a beginner carp angler into, without a doubt, one of the most destructive carp anglers. You get him on a lake, and he's going to empty it.
Yeah,
he really is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was interested what you were saying earlier about sometimes I put liquid on my boilies and kind of like super attract them. And I think sometimes there is a period where that has really, really worked for me, and I'm 100% the attraction has drawn fish in.
Yeah.
Equally, the other end of the spectrum is washed out baits. So I think it's I'd be interested to know what you think is when the washed out bait, because we know it works, and then when does super high attract. So how are you working out that balance then?
My balance would be by looking at the lake, the fishery that you're fishing.
Yeah.
You know, and as I mentioned earlier on, commercial lakes, by their very nature, the type of venues that Bart generally fishes, you know, your linear fisheries and places like that, there's quite a high stock density in those fisheries. Yeah. They need to feed on bait, and they will take smelly baits. You know, they'll straight on it and they'll have it because it's a competition to feed. But when you go to syndicate lakes, generally, the stocking levels are a lot lower. They don't need bait to survive. Yeah. And, you know, places like here today, we're fishing quite a big water, 15 acres in size. It's got depths down to 30 foot, 25 foot, something like that. Yeah. That's a good volume of water. Yeah. There's enough space for these fish to move around, which is why the water's gin clear. But, you know, some of these commercial lakes, they're not, they're in competition with one another. So for those kind of venues, I will be happy to go there and use freshly glugged baits, whereas generally speaking on my syndicate waters and places like that, I would be looking for something a little bit more washed out. Yeah,
so it's funny because we were talking earlier about my trip to France last year, and I've done really, really well in France on the S7, heavily glugging it in the liquid food, really well. I've had some proper big fish hits, you know, 35 fish weeks, which for me is quite a lot because, you know, we have a couple of days out during the week. Yeah. I always fish in France with my missus, so 35 fish, you can imagine, it's a pretty busy week.
It's hard work.
You know, I mean, I remember one lake we went to, between three of us, all fishing the S7, we had a third of the stock. We had 96 fish. When the owner of the lake came to see us on the Tuesday, and I said, we've had 17, she didn't believe me. I said, no, we've had 17 fish. She said, it very rarely does 17 fish in a week. And she didn't believe us.
Amazing fishing, mate, absolutely amazing.
She didn't believe us. Yeah. So that heavily glugged S7 in France, 100% confident with it. But last year I didn't do so well, and I was a million miles off the fish. Yeah. And the only thing I could think of is, have I over-egged the pudding a bit with flavourings? Now that in that one snapshot of the lake, it was really, they might have just not been having it, you know, it might just have been one of them things. But that's the only thing I could put it down to. Yeah. Because I was like, looking out at the lake, I could see where they were, I was on the fish, and
it's one of these unanswerable questions, you know, and a lot of people hold guys that work for companies by their words, but, you know, carp fishing, there is no exact science to it. You're only generalising about things, and I, when I mentioned about the high stocking levels and using flavours and a lot of liquids and stuff like that, generally, you know, there's going to be weeks when the lake's shut down. They're not having it, even though they're heavily stocked. And then, you know, you've got to try and think outside the box. Would it be wise to be using an over-flavoured bait in that kind of situation? Maybe you need to go to the opposite end of the scale. If fishing is very hard and everybody's doing exactly the same thing, maybe you just need to just hold back on the bait and hold back on the flavours. Because, you know, use something like a washed out bait and that.
Because like I say, it's worked for me so many times, and I had that much confidence in it.
Yeah, like different times of the year. So at least summer months they've had a hate the phrase, but they've had a battery in the week before. You know, they have to have there has to come a period even on the most heavily stocked lakes and the easiest lakes where the fishing becomes very slow. You know, and then you've got to do something outside the box. Maybe not use something so smelly. Maybe use something a little bit less subtle. You know, a bit more subtle, I should say. You know, we've been generalising here now in this conversation, just talking about examples in our fishing careers and things like that. And that's the important thing we want to try and get across, is that there is no exact science to carp fishing. There really isn't. It's about seeing what's in front of you and trying to work out the puzzle that's in front of you. And sometimes it is over-glugging baits, and other times it's being the opposite end of that scale. And it's the same with fish meal. Sometimes it's not using fish meal. Sometimes it's using something a little bit different, you know. And that's the good thing about the DNA range. There is something for every kind of situation.
Absolutely.
And it's one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is don't just take one bait to water. We've talked today about the S7 being a great, very acceptable bait on most fisheries, but always have other plans, always carry other options, because when they're not having it on one bait, you can at least chop and change things and try different things. And as you mentioned before, you've got all these memories in your 35 years of carp fishing, 45 years of carp fishing or whatever, that you log. And every time I go to a lake, I'm always going back on that memory bank, looking for, right, when did I experience what I've got in front of me today? Did I do this? Did I do that? Did I put bait out? Did I hold back? Did I use bags? Did I put flavours out? Did I use big baits? Did I use small baits? And if I've got the options there, I can chop and change strings, maybe not put them all on all three rods, just try 2 rods on one tactic and 1 rod on another. And it's about being a versatile angler. And, you know, we mentioned about Bart earlier on. Bart is probably one of the most versatile anglers going. He's a very active angler. I've seen him fish when we fished on Grenville's a 3 years ago, and he was just constantly, you know, and I'm sat there like, it ain't for me. It's not for me, but it works. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It would have been 30 years ago I was like that, and I was chopping, moving swings and things like that. But you've got to be like that if you want to get the success that someone like Bartlett has.
Yeah, because people, funnily enough, point I'd like to mention there, one things I do get asked quite a lot by people who know me through the fishing thing is, are these guys that good, or is it just because they've got some time and free bait? And it's a very easy question to answer. Yeah, they are that good. They've got watercraft, and I put Moz into that bracket as well. The amount of times we've turned up too late with Moz and I've thought, this is going to be a rough shoot. And he's got one. He's found one. Yeah,
well, he's an active angler.
100%.
He's mates with Bart, very active.
And it's not because they get free bait. It's not because they've got the time. It's not because they've got all the fancy gear from all the various sponsors. It's because they've got watercraft. They figure out what they need to do to catch fish on that particular venue. And when
watercraft comes with experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you've been carp fishing a long time, mate.
Yeah.
You know, you're in that category as well. There's an awful lot of good carp anglers out there that when you understand carp fishing, or you don't, you either understand carp fishing or you don't understand carp fishing. And when you don't understand it, you are one of these people that is very easily influenced into, you know, the industry. Need to try this rig, need to try that rig, and all that kind of stuff. But when you sussed it and you know it, you watercraft is the one thing that you rely on the most. And when you know where the carp are, then you've then got to work out how to catch them.
Yeah, I think we are, like the media within carp fishing is conditioned us to fancy rigs and fancy this and fancy that. Like, how long have you been using your rig for?
Mate, the rig that I generally use now, exactly that kind of setup, I've been using it 35 years.
And how many 40-pounders have you caught on it?
God knows, mate. Only 50 pounds, of course.
So your success isn't down to tying the fanciest ring, sharpest up. But
if you've got the so-called 10 best carp anglers in the world here now, whoever they are, because they don't exist, regardless of whether people say they exist, the 10 best carp anglers in the world don't exist. But if you've got your 10 most famous carp anglers in the world, What's your favourite rig? What's your favourite rig? You're going to get 10 different answers.
10 different answers.
So that tells you there ain't a wonder rig in the world. It's about confidence. It's about confidence. If you're confident in something, and that's what I rely on. I spend an awful lot of time fishing, so I'm confident in my rig. And when it comes to bait, I need to be confident in that. And with DNA, I'm absolutely confident. I've been with the company now for 7 years, 8 years, and there ain't a bait that I've used yet that I'm not confident in.
No,
there is only one bait that I've not used, and that is the switch. I've not used it because I mentioned earlier. Well, I definitely will be.
That switch might give you a surprise.
Yeah, definitely will, mate.
Yeah. So we've reminisced a little bit about our time in fishing, and we've talked about one or two things that we might just help you when you're looking at your bait choices. And it's been interesting having a bit of a chat. Yep,
nice one, dude. Good to see you. And hopefully we've got another 24 hours left on this lovely lake in North Yorkshire. Hopefully we might catch another carp or two before we leave tomorrow.